Let's talk about something almost invisible to the untrained eye, but absolutely devastating to a narcissist, the act of becoming unreadable. Now, I want you to think about what that means, not in a superficial, performative way, but in the deepest psychological sense. Because what makes the narcissist powerful in their mind is not just manipulation, it's prediction. They believe they can forecast your next move, emotional response, or breakdown with surgical precision. They believe they know you better than you know yourself, and often they're right, because they've trained you, they've studied you, they've conditioned you. You've been living in a loop they wrote, responding to a script they authored. But the moment you choose to become unreadable, truly unreadable, you take that script, tear it in half, and toss it into the fire. And that, to a narcissist, is intolerable. Now, this isn't about becoming robotic or emotionally cold. It's not about suppressing your humanity. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about reclaiming the agency over your responses that was slowly hijacked through patterns of control. You see, narcissists are masters of emotional mapping. They set traps, subtle ones, and then watch how you respond. Do you defend yourself when accused of something absurd? Do you collapse into self-doubt when they withdraw their affection? Do you beg for clarity when they go silent? Each reaction feeds their blueprint of control. Every time you play the role they've prepared for you, you reinforce their sense of omnipotence. But imagine what happens when you stop reacting the way you're supposed to. You receive their silent treatment, and instead of pleading, you respond with peace. They attempt to provoke you with passive aggression, and instead of defending yourself, you disengage entirely. They bait you with false intimacy, and you respond with stillness. Now the machine short circuits. They can't locate you in the emotional matrix. You're no longer accessible. And that right there is the beginning of freedom. Freedom, because unpredictability in this context isn't chaos, it's sovereignty. You are reclaiming the unpredictability that comes with being truly human, not programmable. You are no longer operating from wounded reflexes that can't push a button and expect the usual output. That changes the entire power dynamic. You become unreadable not because you're hiding, but because you're healing. You're no longer ruled by the need for their approval, their validation, their distorted version of love. You've pulled your sense of worth back from their hands and rooted it in something deeper, your own internal alignment. And now they're lost. Because if a narcissist can't predict you, they can't control you. If they can't control you, they can't dominate you. And if they can't dominate you, then their inflated self-image begins to collapse. Their sense of superiority is exposed for what it always was, a house of cards. One of the most important psychological mechanisms at play here is that narcissists are addicted to certainty, not objective certainty, emotional certainty. They want to know how to win, how to extract, how to dominate. But when you step out of the role, when you no longer respond in ways that feed the cycle, you introduce uncertainty into their world. And that uncertainty is a threat, not just to their control over you, but to their entire identity. Because narcissists at their core are not strong. They are fragile. And uncertainty forces them to face the one thing they fear most, their own emptiness. Now you might ask, why silence? Why not confrontation? Why not call out the manipulation? And that's a fair question. But the truth is, confronting a narcissist directly often gives them what they crave. Attention, drama, relevance. Your emotional response is fuel, but silence, that's starvation. Silence sends a very different message. It says, you are no longer central to my life. I owe you nothing. Not my rage, not my sadness, not even my words. It says, you are irrelevant now. That is the one message their ego cannot process. The power of becoming unreadable is not just that it affects the narcissist, it's that it transforms you. You stop living in response to a tyrant's narrative. You begin making decisions based on principle, not pressure. You become strategic with your attention, intentional with your energy. You start choosing your silence, not out of fear, but out of power. And in doing so, you create space for real clarity, about who you are, what you value, and what you will never tolerate again. When you stop making your emotional life a public script for someone else to exploit, you reclaim the dignity of your inner world. And that is what makes a narcissist regret everything. Not because you punished them, but because you grew beyond them. You became unreadable. And in that silence, you wrote the final chapter without saying a single word. The moment you stop playing the role they've written for you is the moment you start becoming the author of your own story. Don't flinch, don't explain, just walk away and let the silence speak your power. Let's consider what happens when you resist the urge to explain yourself to someone who thrives on distorting your words, because that's what the narcissist does. They twist your explanations, your clarifications, even your good intentions into weapon. You say one thing and somehow it's reinterpreted through a lens that always puts them in the right and you in the wrong. And so you explain again. You rephrase, thinking maybe if you just say it clearly enough, they'll understand or care. But they don't. Not because they're incapable of understanding, but because they refuse to. Understanding you would mean relinquishing control, and that's something they're never going to willingly do. You have to understand this dynamic at the core. When you're in the orbit of a narcissist, the conversation is never really about communication. It's not an exchange of ideas. It's a test, a psychological game. The more you talk, the more ammunition they collect. The more you explain, the more ground you lose. Because you're not talking to someone who's trying to understand you. You're talking to someone who's trying to undo you. This is where the real trap is. We're conditioned, especially those who are empathetic, introspective, maybe even conflict averse, to believe that clear communication solves everything. That if there's a misunderstanding, it's our job to make it make sense. But with narcissists, misunderstanding is not the problem. It's the strategy. The confusion is intentional. The misinterpretation is deliberate. It's meant to disorient you, make you question yourself, make you feel like you're the unstable one. And that's how they win. Not by force, but by erosion. Bit by bit, they chip away at your self-trust. You start wondering if maybe you're being too sensitive. Maybe you do need to explain it one more time. Maybe if you just use the right words, they'll finally get it. But they won't, because the game isn't played on the level of reason. It's played on the level of control. So the shift here, the strategy that flips the entire dynamic, is silence. Not passive silence, not from defeat or fear, but strategic silence. Silence that knows it owes no explanation. Silence that understands it is not obligated to keep proving its worth or defending its integrity. That kind of silence is not weakness. It's strength in its purest form. It's restraint rooted in clarity. You see, explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you is not humility. It's self-betrayal. Because every time you justify yourself to a narcissist, you're not clarifying the situation. You're validating their frame. You're playing in their sandbox. And the longer you stay there, the more you lose track of what's real. What makes this so difficult, though, is that silence feels counterintuitive, especially for intelligent, emotionally attuned people. People who pride themselves on reason, on being able to articulate and process and repair. But with narcissists, the usual tools don't apply. They use your clarity against you. They bait you into over-explaining. They press your moral buttons. And when you finally break and defend yourself, they sit back smirking because you've given them exactly what they wanted. Your energy, your attention, your emotional engagement. Strategic silence is not about becoming cold or shutting down emotionally. It's about learning to discern where your energy is worthy. It's about knowing that your internal peace is not a prize to be negotiated. It's a boundary, a wall that protects the sacred space of your psyche. Because in that silence, something begins to shift. The narcissist doesn't get the reaction they're used to. They don't get the opportunity to twist your words. They don't get to pull you back into the loop. They're left with nothing but their own emptiness. And that is terrifying to them. Because for the first time, they're alone with themselves. And that's silence, your silence, acts as a mirror. It reflects back everything they've been trying to avoid, their lack of control, their fragility, their falseness. But more importantly, that silence restores you. It gives you the space to hear yourself again, to remember what your voice sounds like when it's not under siege, to recall your own inner truth, separate from the constant noise of gaslighting and manipulation. And from that place, you can begin to rebuild something solid, something authentic. You start living in alignment, not in reaction. So don't let anyone tell you that you owe them an explanation when they've already proven they're not listening. Don't confuse compassion with compliance. Don't trade your peace for the illusion of understanding. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to go silent. When you stop explaining yourself to those who distort your truth, you reclaim the narrative of your own life. That silence, it's not the absence of voice, it's the presence of power. Use it wisely. Let it speak for you. Let's talk about withdrawal, not in the physical sense, but in the psychological, emotional, and even spiritual realm. When you decide to stop engaging with a narcissist, especially after they've fed on your attention, your reactions, your emotional energy, it creates an unbearable vacuum for them. A void they cannot tolerate. And this isn't just a dramatic metaphor. It's a reflection of how their internal structure is actually built. You have to understand narcissists don't truly possess a stable sense of self. They don't relate to others from a place of wholeness. Their entire identity depends on external validation. They are like mirrors with nothing behind them, only able to reflect what's projected onto them. So when you pull your presence away, when you no longer respond, when you remove your attention, that source of narcissistic supply, they're confronted with something they're psychologically unprepared to deal with, the absence of significance. This is why silence is so much more powerful than people realize. It's not just the lack of words, it's the presence of detachment. A narcissist can fight you when you argue. They can manipulate you when you explain. They can bait you when you explain. They can bait you when you try to correct the record. But silence. Silence is a battlefield where they're unequipped to fight. It doesn't give them anything to spin. It doesn't fuel their story. It just sits there, empty, still, undeniable, and that drives them mad. Why? Because when you withdraw, you become unpredictable. And unpredictability threatens control. Narcissists survive by being able to read your patterns, exploit your empathy, anticipate your responses. They run on loops. You react, they control. You explain, they twist. You fight, they escalate. But when you refuse to play the game, you break the loop. You short-circuit their entire strategy. And that's silence. It echoes in their mind because they no longer know where they stand in your reality. Worse, they're not sure they exist in it at all anymore. That's the existential threat. Think about it this way. The narcissist sees themselves as the sun around which others must orbit. But when you go silent, when you detach, you're saying, without words, I am my own center of gravity now. I don't revolve around you anymore. And that kind of independence isn't just offensive to the narcissist, it's annihilating. Because they measure their value by how much you need them, how much they've gotten into your head, how tightly they can wrap themselves around your sense of self. And if you no longer need them, if they can no longer make you react, then what are they? That question, that realization is unbearable for them. And here's the paradox. Your silence makes the narcissist obsess over you even more, not less. They don't move on peacefully. They ruminate. They rewrite the past to try and make sense of your sudden absence. They might smear you, try to provoke you, test your boundaries. But beneath all of that is a deep panic because they've lost access to the one thing that made them feel real, your attention. It's important to understand that withdrawal is not passive. It's not running away. It's not giving up. It's a deeply active psychological stance. It says, I see the game and I refuse to play it. It requires clarity. It requires inner strength. And above all, it requires a profound respect for your own energy. Because every time you react to a narcissist, you're not just giving them attention, you're giving them a little piece of yourself. And when you've been around one long enough, you begin to realize just how fragmented you've become from doing that. Your peace, your focus, your self-worth, it gets chipped away bit by bit until there's nothing left but reaction. That's what withdrawal corrects. It brings everything back home. It says, my energy is mine again. My mind is mine. My time, my voice, my silence, they belong to me. And that psychological reclamation is the beginning of freedom. Now, the challenge here is that it won't feel satisfying at first. It won't feel like revenge. It won't come with closure. And that's the trap. Because if you're still seeking resolution, still hoping they'll understand or feel remorse, you're still tethered to the system. The real power in withdrawal is when you no longer need them to understand. You no longer care whether they regret it. You're no longer waiting for them to validate the pain they caused. You've moved past that. Because what matters now is not what they feel, but what you've reclaimed. And here's the final twist, the darker, more ironic one. In your silence, they do feel it. They feel the absence of you like a vacuum, like a spotlight they were basking in that's suddenly been shut off. And they don't know how to function in the dark because they never learned to generate their own light. And that's what makes them regret everything. Not because they've grown, not because they've seen the error of their ways, but because they've lost control of what they once thought was theirs. You. So don't underestimate the power of your withdrawal. Don't mistake your silence for invisibility. Because in the eyes of the narcissist, your absence is louder than your presence ever was. Let your silence speak. Let your absence echo. And know that the moment you stopped engaging, you started winning. When it comes to narcissists, there's one thing they fear even more than exposure, and that's irrelevance. You see, narcissism isn't just inflated self-importance. It's a hollow shell that constantly seeks validation, attention, and admiration to survive. It's not confidence. It's not strength. It's dependency masked as dominance. And the most efficient way to dismantle it, to break it down at the root, is to render it invisible, to act as if it doesn't matter. Because to a narcissist, not mattering is psychological death. Let me walk you through this. Narcissists build their entire persona around being at the center of your emotional universe. They test you, push you, bait you, and praise you, so long as you keep dancing to their rhythm. The moment you step off the dance floor, though, you become a threat. Not because you've attacked them, not because you've confronted them, but because you've disengaged. And that disengagement, that refusal to respond, is the exact mechanism that causes their ego to collapse in on itself. It's not rage that breaks a narcissist. It's not confrontation. It's not revenge. It's indifference. And indifference is much harder than people think because it requires discipline. It requires internal strength. Especially when you've been emotionally entangled with a narcissist, when your nervous system has been trained to react to their highs and lows, their praise and punishment cycles. But to step into indifference is to step out of their illusion. You're saying, I see you and I choose not to respond. Respond. Not out of weakness, but because you no longer define my experience. And that's what kills them, because narcissists thrive on significance. They need to believe they matter more than anyone else in the room. They feed on emotional engagement, whether positive or negative. Praise fuels them. But so does outrage. Kindness gives them control. But so does defensiveness. The common denominator? Your energy. If they have it, they win. If they don't, they disintegrate. So when you no longer flinch, no longer explain yourself, no longer feed their delusions with reactions, they panic. They might lash out, try to draw you back in with guilt, with charm, with chaos. Because in their world, anything is better than being nothing to you. Anything is better than being forgotten. That's why they come back. Not because they love you, not because they've changed, but because they can't tolerate the idea that your world might go on without them at the center. This is what makes irrelevance such a devastating weapon. It doesn't rely on external conflict. It doesn't require you to destroy them. It just requires you to reclaim your space And here's the key. This space isn't just physical, it's psychological, emotional, spiritual. You stop giving them access to your inner world. You close the door they used to walk through freely. And once that door shuts, they're left outside, cold, confused, and most of all, irrelevant. You begin to redirect your energy inward. You rebuild your self-worth, not by proving it to them, but by no longer needing them as a mirror. Because that's all they ever were. A mirror that distorted you to keep themselves intact. And when you finally look away, when you stop asking that mirror who you are, the narcissist ceases to function, not because you fought back, but because you stopped looking. It's counterintuitive. We're wired to seek resolution, to want them to understand the pain they caused, to wait for the apology that will never come. But real freedom isn't found in their recognition. It's found in your release. And that release is quiet. It's dignified. It doesn't announce it. It simply removes itself. And in that removal, you do the one thing they never anticipated. You make them irrelevant. Now, some people mistake this for cruelty, as if cutting someone off emotionally or psychologically is some act of vengeance. But here's the truth. You don't owe continued relevance to someone who tried to fracture your soul to keep their own ego inflated. That's not cruelty. That's self-respect. There's an ancient principle at work here. In Stoic philosophy, they say, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. And when you stop reacting to the narcissist, you remove yourself from the imaginary battlefield they've built in your mind. You no longer wage war against the illusions they projected. You walk away from the arena altogether. And that act, that subtle, powerful act, is more destructive to them than any fight you could have staged, because they're not built to be forgotten, and they're not built to be unimportant. Their entire identity depends on your engagement. When you take that away, you don't just hurt their feelings. You dismantle their framework. You show them that your life does not orbit their dysfunction, and that's what leaves them shattered. So if you want to break a narcissist, don't shout, don't argue, don't explain. Just become silent, then become indifferent. And finally, become indifferent. And finally, become irrelevant to them. Because in that moment, they are no longer the central character in your story. You are. When they realize you've moved on, not in anger, but in complete detachment, it won't just bruise their ego. It will erase the illusion that they ever had power over you at all. And that, in the end, is the deepest cut of all. Narcissists have an uncanny ability to weave themselves into the most intimate threads of your identity. They'll mirror your dreams, your fears, your values, until it feels like they're a part of you. Once they've settled into that space, psychologically and emotionally, they begin to rewrite the narrative. Not overtly at first, but subtly. They chip away at your confidence, question your perception, and slowly, methodically replace your voice with theirs, until one day you wake up unsure of who you are without their approval. That's not just manipulation, it's colonization of the soul. To break that grip, to sever the cords that bind your identity to theirs, you must reclaim the most essential power a human being can possess. The power to define your own worth. This is where self-validation becomes not only revolutionary, but necessary. Because here's the reality. Narcissists are masters at controlling perception. They will never hand you closure. They will never acknowledge your pain in a way that liberates you. Why? Because doing so would require them to relinquish control over the narrative, and they'd rather rewrite history than admit you were right. So if you wait for a narcissist to validate your suffering, your growth, or your boundaries, you will wait forever. And worse, you'll stay tethered to them by the very hope that they might one day see you clearly. But you don't need their clarity. You need your own. That's the pivot, the turning point. When you stop asking, do they see me? And start asking, do I see myself? When you stop looking to the source of the wound for the medicine, because the wound and the medicine cannot exist in the same person when that person has built their sense of self on your erosion. It's difficult, though, because narcissists condition you to second-guess your instincts. That's the essence of gaslighting, this quiet erosion of your internal compass. You start to wonder if maybe you are too sensitive. Maybe you did overreact. Maybe it is your... And once that seed of doubt is planted, it doesn't just affect your relationship with them. It infiltrates your entire worldview. You stop trusting yourself. And when that happens, they've won. Because a person who cannot trust themselves is infinitely easier to control. So the antidote is radical self-trust. It's not arrogance, it's not denial, it's the decision to anchor yourself in your own experience. Even when someone else tries to invalidate it, it's saying, no, I was there. I know what I felt. I know what I saw. I don't need permission to believe in my own truth, and that's where healing begins. You start to untangle your identity from the illusions they created. You stop performing for approval. You stop contorting yourself into the version of that kept them calm, kept them flattered, kept them attached. And you start becoming someone they can no longer recognize. Not because you've changed who you are, but because you've returned to who you are. And here's what's remarkable. When you no longer need their validation, they lose all leverage. They can't manipulate someone who isn't seeking their approval. They can't guilt trip someone who's no longer emotionally dependent. They can't distort the reality of someone who is deeply rooted in their own. This is the internal exit. Long before the physical distance, the silence, the no contact, there's an internal exit. A quiet but seismic shift in which you step back into your own psychological territory and reclaim ownership. You say, I will not abandon myself just to keep you from leaving. That is the moment of liberation. And it happens long before they even realize you've begun to pull away. They will, of course, feel it. A narcissist always senses when they're losing control. And often, that's when they double down. Love bombing, gaslighting, future faking, guilt tripping, not because they love you, but because they fear losing access to the emotional power you once gave so freely. But this time, something is different. You're not reacting. You're observing. You're no longer seduced by the illusion because you finally see the pattern. And more importantly, you see your own worth outside of their reaction to it. This internal shift is irreversible. Once you reclaim your self-trust, once you validate your own experience, there's no going back. Not because you hate them, not because you want revenge, but because you've outgrown the version of you that needed them to see your value in order for it to exist. You've evolved past the illusion, and that for a narcissist is unbearable, because it proves what they feared most, that they were never the source of your power, only the distraction from it. So don't wait for their apology. Don't seek their validation. Don't give them the power to determine when or how you get to heal. That's your domain. And when you finally step into it, not only do you break free, you break the very illusion they tried to trap you in. Because the deepest form of revenge is not destruction, it's elevation. And when you rise without their permission, without their validation, without their narrative, you remind them of the one truth they can't control. Your worth was never theirs to define. When dealing with a narcissist, the most profound transformation doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from disengagement, and not the kind of disengagement that's performative, where you're still emotionally entangled even if the words have stopped. I'm talking about true detachment, psychological sovereignty. When their words no longer pierce, when their silence no longer controls, when their presence or absence doesn't alter your emotional stability. That's the ultimate shift. And paradoxically, it's also the most devastating blow you can deliver to someone whose identity is built on controlling yours. Narcissists don't just want attention, they crave emotional relevance. Their sense of self is fragile, dependent on the reaction they can provoke in others. Whether it's admiration or fear, desire or guilt, it doesn't matter. What matters is that they're still the gravitational center of your emotional world. That's how they feed the illusion of their own significance. And so long as you're reacting, whether in love, anger, sorrow, or confusion, they remain in control. So what happens when you stop reacting? When your silence isn't just a strategy, but a signal that the game is over? That's when they feel the full weight of what they've lost. Not just a person, but a mirror that once reflected back the image they so desperately curated. When you take that mirror away, they are left with themselves. And that is often the one thing they've spent their entire lives trying to avoid. Detachment is not coldness, it's not vengeance, it's clarity. It's the decision to no longer allow someone else's dysfunction to dictate your peace. It's a reclaiming of responsibility. Not for them, but for you, for your boundaries, your values, your energy, your future. And once that shift happens internally, everything external begins to rearrange itself accordingly. You stop needing to explain yourself. You stop rehearsing dialogues in your head, wondering how you could have said it better or what you should have done differently. That entire mental loop dissolves. Because you understand deeply that no explanation was ever going to be enough for someone committed to misunderstanding you. And what's more, your silence becomes a statement, not of weakness, but of strength. It says, I do not owe you access to me. That sentence, when lived rather than spoken, dismantles the narcissist's illusion of dominance. They can't manipulate what they can't reach. They can't wound someone who no longer exposes the vulnerable parts of their psyche to the same abuse. Over and over, hoping this time it will be different. In essence, you become emotionally untouchable. Not invulnerable, not numb, but grounded. You feel things deeply, but your reactions are no longer dictated by another person's emotional chaos. You learn to observe rather than absorb. And in doing so, you reclaim the inner stillness that narcissistic dynamics are designed to destroy. Now, this kind of detachment doesn't happen overnight. It takes work, serious work. You have to unlearn codependency patterns, rebuild your intuition, reestablish a relationship with yourself that's based on truth, not performance. You have to resist the very human urge to seek justice or closure from someone incapable of offering it. You have to let go of the fantasy that one day they'll wake up and realize your worth. They won't, because their entire ego structure depends on not seeing it. But that's not your concern anymore. Your concern is building a life that is no longer revolving around trauma, survival, or reaction. Your concern is living in alignment with your values, your goals, your peace. And anyone who tries to pull you out of that alignment does not deserve front row access to your life. This is where your silence becomes sacred. Not a punishment, but a boundary. Not a wall, but a filter. You're not shutting down, you're leveling up. You're choosing discernment over chaos, self-respect over people-pleasing, power over pity. And the beauty of this path is that the deeper your detachment grows, the clearer your vision becomes. You start to see the manipulations not as personal failures, but as patterns. You see the emotional bait for what it is, an attempt to pull you back into the dance, and you simply choose not to participate. You let them spin alone while you walk away in stillness. That's when the regret kicks in, if it ever does. But by then, you'll realize something crucial. It doesn't even matter. Their regret is irrelevant to your healing. Their remorse, or lack thereof, has nothing to do with your value. The peace you've built is not conditional on their awakening. And that's what makes it real. That's what makes it yours. So if you're wondering how to truly break the narcissist grip, it's not about louder arguments, more dramatic exits, or clever retorts. It's about withdrawing your energy so completely, so thoroughly that they can no longer use you as a character in their self-serving narrative. And when you do that, when you choose internal detachment over external reaction, you win a battle they never even saw coming. Because the most unshakable power isn't noise. It's silence rooted in truth. And once you stand in that truth, you'll never need to prove your worth again.